Hey guys, Stefan here again. So this video is about why Bitcoin is not a fluke. So we've got this decentralized money. There's no office, there's no CEO, there's no government mandate saying you must use Bitcoin, and yet Bitcoin has gone from $0 in 2009 to around $10,000 in early 2018. What's going on there? Is this a lucky accident? Is it a flash in the pan? Is it just a fluke? I can understand how an outsider to this world might think of it like, okay, it's just like the tulip bubble. It's just some crazy speculative thing, or it's like the Beanie Babies. It's like the dot-com bubble. But I think it's because they're not seeing the method to the madness. And in order to really see the method to that madness, you've got to actually look into the Austrian School of Economics. So what is Austrian economics? It's a school of economic thought that has a certain emphasis on deductive reasoning and methodological individualism. So some of the leading lights and some of the founders of the school would be considered Carl Menger, von Bauwerk, and Ludwig von Mises. And some of the more later leading lights would be people like Murray Rothbard and Friedrich Hayek. So one special thing about Austrian economics is an emphasis on the spontaneous emergence or spontaneous organizing power of prices in the market. So if you weren't into Austrian economics, you might have thought more along the lines of the state theory of money, which is where, say, a government mandates a certain currency and that's just the currency that everybody uses. Or an alternative on that, it might be something like, well, because the government requires that you pay taxes in a certain currency, well, that's what gives that currency value. So let's now flick into screen share and I'll show you one example, one particular essay which I think is fantastic for trying to understand this. So it's called On the Origins of Money and it's by Carl Menger, the founder of the Austrian School. So now just bear in mind that as we're stepping through this essay, it's from 1892. So, oh yeah, and you can download the PDF and EPUB files there for free as well. So, one sec. Okay. So, one thing with this book, or this essay, a key concept is saleability, which is this idea that commodities on the market can compete amongst each other, in a sense, to become the money, to become the most saleable good. That's one of the key points that I want you to think about as we're stepping through this. So in the intro, well, let's just go to the intro here. So in the intro, he's pointing out here, obviously, it's obvious a commodity should be given up by its owner in exchange for another more useful to him. Okay, so it's sort of like, okay, yeah, fine, everyone gets that part. But why do people trade their valuable goods for these little metal discs, right? As in like a gold coin or whatever. Why is that? Well, that's, isn't that mysterious? How do we explain this? So, let's move into the next section. So I'll just find it, the section. Oh yeah, so here it is. So to assume that certain commodities, the precious metals in particular, had been exalted into the medium of exchange by general convention or law, etc., etc. It's sort of pointing out that it's not adequate to just assume that we use gold because the government said to use gold. There's more to it than that. So let's move into the next section. So in this section, he's talking about how even in a scenario where A wants what B has and B wants what C has and C wants what A has, right, in some sort of circular motion, even that exchange would have been hard to do. And what he's getting at there is saying that, well, this would have been insurmountable were it not for differing degrees of salableness of commodities, right? And so he's suggesting here that, in a sense, coming back to that point I was making earlier, is that the theory of money necessarily presupposes a theory of the salableness of goods. And if we grasp this, we shall be able to understand how the almost unlimited salableness of money is a special case. It's a difference of degree. It's that gold is just the most, well, in back then, was the most saleable thing compared to other commodities that would have been lower on the hierarchy, let's say, lower on the moneyness scale, let's say. So let's move on to section 5, and one of the cool things about this section is it's kind of spelling out what makes saleability. So here he's talking about a few examples. So, you know, how many people want it, what's the purchasing power of those persons. And I think this one here, number 3, is a really key one. It's upon the available quantity of the commodity in relation to the yet unsupplied total, you know, demand for it. So that's kind of coming to how scarce that commodity is, because I think that's one of the arguments around Bitcoin, because it is so scarce because of its monetary policy, and that, you know, as we've, you know, shown in prior videos, that 21 million cap is what makes it so scarce, and that's what, in my view, makes Bitcoin the most saleable commodity. It's just going to take time for everyone to kind of wake up to that and realize that point. So basically in this section he's talking here about how its saleability has a spatial component to it and a time component, because when we want to store our value, so to speak, we want to do that not just in, you know, literally today, but also for tomorrow and for, you know, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. And that's where the space and time components come up. So in the spatial section, you can see here, he's saying the degree to which the goods lend themselves to transport and the cost of the transport. So you can see, as an example, why it would have been difficult to if hay were money rather than gold, right? Because hay might kind of blow around and there'd be very low value to weight ratio, because hay is much less scarce than gold is, right? So you can sort of start to get a picture there that, well, back then gold made sense because it was such a high value to weight ratio, and it was, you know, relative to the technology available at the time, it was a good thing. Now in the digital age, Bitcoin is the most easily transportable thing because it's all on the internet. It's like sending an email. That's how fast it is. So then there's a few other points there around how connected are the markets and so on. You could talk here even about how in the, you know, now in this digital age, we really need a digital money that's not sort of encumbered or not centrally controlled or centrally inflatable, and that's kind of where the whole idea of the decentralized money comes from. So with the time component, this is coming to how durable is it. So gold was very, very durable. It was hard to destroy. I think it still is hard to destroy. So that made it good for preservation. And likewise with Bitcoin, you can back up your private keys. You can print it out and laminate that, or you can have it engraved, have the private key engraved and stored in a safe, or you can have multi-signature, and there's all these different ways you can preserve it and store it. So these are examples where Bitcoin again is demonstrating better characteristics of saleability. So next section, let me just find it. So here, so he's just commenting here that it's been the subject of universal remark that for certain commodities there existed a greater, more constant and more effective demand than for other commodities less desirable. And I think that's coming back to that concept of commodities, there being a hierarchy of commodities, and there's a different level of how saleable some of them are. Let me just find the next section I wanted to talk to, which I think, so this one here. So let's say, okay, I'll read the section. So under these circumstances, when anyone has brought goods not highly saleable to market, the idea uppermost in his mind is to exchange them not only for such as he happens to be in need of, as in the things he wanted, but if he can't do that, well, for other goods which he, if he did not want themselves, were more saleable than his own. So let's make an example, just a quick silly example. Let's say you've got 10 commodities in the world, and gold is number 1 and silver is number 2, and you've got number 8, right? Now here we're not talking about value, we're talking about saleability. You know, so the item you might have might be really, really highly valuable, like this complex machinery or a telescope or whatever, but it might not be as saleable because maybe your telescope is not as divisible. You can't just cut 1/10 of your telescope. Well, that ruins the whole value of the whole telescope, right? So let's say you went to this market and for whatever reason they didn't have gold there, but one guy had silver. Well, maybe say you've got your telescope, maybe you would trade your telescope for that guy's silver, because in your mind silver is more saleable than a telescope, and later if I go out to a market I can trade that silver for gold. And now once you've got gold, well then you can buy anything, right? Now take that into the modern day world. Well, Bitcoin is going to become that number 1 thing that everybody's trying to trade for, because Bitcoin is the most saleable thing, because it's the most scarce, as we've mentioned. So that's how I think about this. So it's basically people wanting to trade up the hierarchy of saleability, let's say. Now the next thing, this is I think this is a really cool part here. So you remember how I was talking about the spontaneous nature of markets and the Austrian understanding of markets? So you can see here, there is this section here. Men have been led with increasing knowledge of their individual interests, each by his own interests. So without a convention, without legal compulsion, and not even a regard for the common interest. It's literally each person in their own interest wanted to do this process that I was talking about before, of moving up the chain of saleability, so to speak. So yeah, and then the next part here, and so it has come to pass that as man became increasingly conversant with these economic advantages, mainly by an insight become traditional, and by the habit of economic action, these commodities, which relatively to both space and time are most saleable, have in every market become the wares which it is not only in the interest of everyone to accept in exchange for his own less saleable goods, but which also are those he actually does readily accept. Right? And so I think the other thing is, later in this section of the essay, he's pointing out here about how significant a factor of habit it is. And I think the modern day way to understand that is feedback loops, right? As more and more people all start seeing and coming to that the same conclusion about which one is the most saleable, people are going to all start piling into that. So what's the next section? Let me just find. Yep, so yeah, the next section here. So here he's saying it's no accident, it's nor the consequence of state compulsion, nor voluntary convention of traders that affected this. It was just the apprehending of their individual self-interest which brought it to pass that all the more economically advanced nations accepted the precious metals as money, right? So I think that's a really interesting point, because it also talks about, it bleeds into the next point, which we'll get to. So you can see here in section 9 of the essay, he's saying money has not been generated by law. In its origin, it is social and not a state institution, right? So I think, and like if you have a look at the rest of that section, you get a sense that it's possible that money rose on the market, but then just the way it played out is that governments then mandated and made a law saying, okay, gold is the money of the land, and gold will be exchangeable for this, or they made a currency that was tied to gold. Yeah, but then what it is that in the modern day people don't understand that, so they confuse it and they think that, oh, we use it because that's what the state says we must use. But actually it's more like the other way around. It arose on the market, and then the government sort of layered on the legislation on top of that. So I hope that explains for you why Bitcoin's success is not an accident, and that it's really more like it's a superior money due to it being the most saleable commodity. So from my point of view, I view this like this is going to be a historical wealth transfer as we witness the monetization of Bitcoin. And what we what we call this in our sort of community is hyper Bitcoinization. So that's basically the gist of this idea of what are the origins of money. So in summary, I hope that's helped clarify Bitcoin's real value to you guys. So if you like this content, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.